Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, a special podcast from the creators of Bad Gays. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer, historian, and member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin, and also at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudi Gernreich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
So last week, we left off Peter Mandelson with a series of scandals during his time as a minister in the governments of Tony Blair in the era of New Labour. And people were making the confident prediction that his career in politics was toast. So where are we picking up this week, Hugh?
Well, Ben, today we're coming towards the close, the last couple of chapters of the Mandelson story. And honestly, I think that story couldn't be more pertinent at its current moment. As we're recording this on the 18th of May, 2026, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is facing a potential leadership challenge and a collapse in legitimacy following two major crises. What's interesting is I think both these crises are the responsibility of Peter Mandelson, one quite directly. The other are consequences of the changes of which Mandelson has been the driving force for almost 40 years. So the first crisis is Starmer's appointment of Mandelson as ambassador to the United States, despite his having failed a Foreign Office vetting procedure, and the fallout of that once Mandelson was outed as a close long-term friend of the child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. The other is the complete decimation of Labour in the recent local council elections and in national elections for the Welsh and Scottish devolved assemblies, which saw the party lose close to 1,500 local council seats, and in Wales to lose a century-long winning streak as the country's largest party. So in today's episode, we'll talk about Mandelson's journey from PM to peer, and we'll leave off as he is about to become ambassador. And we'll also discuss how his enormous influence over that time, usually behind the scenes, has led to a Labour Party, and indeed the two-party system itself, on the edge of total collapse, less than 30 years after New Labour's 1997 triumph.
And eagle-eared listeners will notice that we had originally promised 5 episodes of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, and what you've just heard is that, in fact, there are going to be 6 episodes of Mandelson, A Homosexual History. But it turns out there was just so much detail that we didn't want to cut, and so we've decided to add an episode so we have time to cover it all.
Yes, that's my fault. I hope you'll appreciate the 6 episodes. So when we left Peter, it was 2001. He'd just won re-election to the seat of Hartlepool. "I'm a fighter, not a quitter," he declaimed from the stage at the vote count, you'll remember. Yet, having won back that seat, no ministerial position was forthcoming. And so it turned out that he was a bit of a quitter. In 2004, before the end of the parliament, he wanted to leave. However, it's not actually legal for an MP to resign. If you're not expelled from parliament or you don't die, the only way to actually leave parliament is to become legally disqualified from sitting in it. So there's these two positions that exist as a sort of legal fiction, which are theoretically jobs in service of the Crown. And if you're working as a job in service of the Crown, you can't be an MP. One of which is called the Steward and Bailiff of the Manor of Northstead, and the other is called Steward and Bailiff of the Chiltern Hundreds.
The UK political system would literally rather come up with fictional stewards and bailiffs than write a rule that says you can actually resign from Parliament.
Yeah, this is a consequence of an unwritten constitution, I suppose, and it's called taking the Chiltern Hundreds when you resign. And this is what Mandelson did. Actually, he took the Steward and Bailiff of the Manor of Northstead. And he took this option to resign from Parliament because he had another job waiting for him. He was appointed as the UK's European Commissioner, that is to sit on the executive cabinet of the European Union, making Mandelson one of the most powerful politicians in Europe as the Trade Commissioner. And it's an extraordinarily important position. It puts you right at the top of the tree when it comes to negotiating bilateral deals, determining European trade policy, and importantly, enforcing compliance with those policies across the whole of the trading bloc. So, knowing what we know about Mandelson so far, Ben, what do you think was the reason that Mandelson himself claimed that he took this very powerful, very well-remunerated position?
It's funny because I wouldn't have thought is he would have been so open about it. But anyway, I mean, power?
Well, you might think so, but no, the real reason, he would write some 20 years later, was actually the atmosphere of homophobia in the UK. Writing in 2023 for The Times, Peter said, quote, "Leaving this hostile environment behind was the real reason I was determined to go to Brussels to become EU Trade Commissioner. I was travelling the world, working intensively, separated from Ronaldo most of the time." Being apart so much added to the strain on us as we prioritise shielding ourselves from unwelcome media scrutiny. I have to admit, considering his life trajectory so far, I personally think this sounds a little bit like he's rewriting history. If I really wanted to shield my boyfriend from media scrutiny and develop more of a home life, I don't think the ideal job I'd take could be EU Trade Commissioner.
Yeah, just to remind readers, Reynaldo is Peter Mandelson's long-suffering better half.
Yeah, so this time boyfriend, later husband. Yeah, and I'd mentioned him briefly in the last episode. His name is Reynaldo Avila da Silva. And this feels like quite a good time to discuss him. So what we know about Reynaldo is extremely limited because maintaining his privacy became a huge motivation for Mandelson in dealing with the press. I think probably for both of their sakes. Reynaldo is usually described, especially early in their relationship, as a translator, but really we don't know that much about him at all. And I think both Mandelson and da Silva were justified in this, to be honest. I joked a bit about him being the reason Mandelson took the job, but the atmosphere Mandelson describes around press coverage of their relationship was extremely euphemistic and distasteful. But the thing is, not only is Reynaldo an important part of Peter's life story, he's now also part of this news story himself, because he too was a beneficiary of Jeffrey Epstein's largesse. He took a large sum of money from him in order to further his education, taking a course in osteopathy. And he's also the director or a director of Mandelson's business, Wilbury Limited. And he features unredacted in Epstein's birthday book. I'm trying to be as fair-minded as I can in this miniseries in terms of acknowledging the very real environment of media homophobia and intrusion that Mandelson experienced across his career, while balancing the way that he navigated that environment at the time, like his own behavior, and the way he's manipulated the response to that homophobic history himself for his own ends after the fact. So claiming that defending Reynaldo from media intrusion and homophobia was the reason that he took the job as the EU Trade Commissioner some 20 years later seems like a good example of this to me. Reynaldo was born in 1972. No age gap discourse, please, Ben.
I was not going to offer any. They are both consenting adults. Peter Mandelson has done many wrong things, but that is not one of them.
Yes, and he moved to London in the 1990s, where he studied, and the two men first met and seemed to have got together in 1998. And this was perhaps the peak year of Mandelson enduring these homophobic attacks in print, because later in that year, Punch magazine ran a scurrilous rumour, supposedly spread around the gay expat community of Rio de Janeiro. It was mid-November, just a few weeks before Peter was supposed to visit Brazil in his role as Secretary of State for Trade, when the magazine revealed, they alleged, that in July, on a visit to Rio de Janeiro, he'd had a wild night out on the town with the director of the British Council, Martin Dole. The men, and again both Dole and Mandelson denied this at the time, visited a gay club called Le Boy. Le Boy. This is a quote from the article at the time, the Punch article. Quote, "The main attractions of Le Boy include non-stop male strip shows, and at weekends there is a bizarre act involving men having live sex in huge glass fish tanks. There is also a darkened back room at the club where couples can go to pleasure each other." End quote.
And that is the same back room that our wonderful subscribers can ask us many questions about in our Gaggany Gunkle segments.
Can and do. I mean, that sounds plausible for a gay club in Rio. I do love the idea that dark rooms are a place for couples to go to to have sex.
Okay, you laugh, but actually there was a party that I won't name, but which approached its marketing in this writing description that I would describe as sort of Rupi Kaur presents chicken soup for the tender queer soul. And they advertised their policy that you could only go into the darkroom as a couple.
Oh, wow.
Like, if you enter the darkroom as a solo person, you'll be booted.
Gentlemen, you can't cruise in here. This is the darkroom. Anyway, the piece continues, quote, "After a couple of hours of loud techno music in the company of lithe young boys, the man, tipped by some to be a future Prime Minister of Britain, decided it was time to move on. Last call that night was a notorious gay bar called Encontras, which is known throughout the community as a place where the majority of male hustlers are under 20. It's also renowned as a bar where customers' drinks are frequently spiked so that hustlers can rob and beat their potential clients in nearby alleyways," end quote.
So Peter's sort of rolling around in the Brazilian demi-monde.
This is the allegation. You'll pick up a lot of sort of innuendos and hints within that, which are, well, to my mind, The reference to male hustlers under 20 and live young boys, I think, is clearly a euphemistic accusation of potentially pedophilia, which I think is like obscene because, you can be 19 and go to a gay bar. You're an adult.
Right. And also this idea of like techno music and dancing young boys is just like, well, what do you mean by that? You don't mean that. You mean dancing
young
men, surely.
Presumably, yes. But as soon as the article hit the press, the New Labour team did a remarkably good job at suppressing it. One can kind of imagine Alistair Campbell had a lot of strings to pull that week. The implication was that Mandelson was behaving recklessly while on government business. Like, personally, I think it all sounds like good, clean fun. But the undertone clearly is, check out this faggot being messy, And
again, literally, this is a cabinet minister having a night out that's, as far as we know, doesn't affect the job that he has to do. And
yeah, and there's no discussion here about his behavior on it. There's no implication that he's gone to a gay bar, he's gone to a gay club, he's allowed a life.
It's also one of these things where, like, if you imagine describing any other establishment the way that this is being described, right? They then went to one of the city's most notorious dens of iniquity where, dancing young girls, and it's just like one of these like cabarets in Montmartre or something,
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So Punch was
like the kind of thing that every straight tourist does when they visit Paris or New Orleans.
Right, exactly, yeah. But this was 1998, and this was obviously a loaded accusation. Punch was a historically significant UK publication, but it closed in 1992 and then been relaunched in 1996 by Mohammed Al-Fayed, the owner of Harrods. He's now dead, but he's currently the subject of a posthumous police investigation into hundreds of cases of historic sexual abuse. Despite Al-Fayed's investment, it was dying as a magazine, and the internet was still very much a minority interest. There wasn't really any form of social media, so it should have stayed in Punch, really, had not the leader of the Conservatives, William Hague, referred to Peter as Lord Mandelson of Rio during the debate on the Queen's speech, ironically. Hague's comment allowed papers to jump on the story under the guise of sort of covering the controversy, whether it's true or not, in much the same way as I have just now. And within this environment of innuendo and smear, I think Mandelson's caginess around his new relationship, especially with a younger Brazilian man, was entirely justified. And actually, Hague's stunt would later backfire when it was revealed that he had shared hotel rooms with his special advisor, Christopher Myers, and he was subject to exactly the same kind of speculation regarding his sexuality.
Don't come in, Mum. We're having a special advisors meeting.
Yes, spadding everywhere.
Were those his live-in special advisors, or?
Well, William Hague is a happily married man, but this has been something that at the time was also haunting him, and I think this is probably much the same in terms of unfounded innuendo. Indeed, coverage at the time leaned into whatever they could about this couple. The opinion writer and disgusting bigot Richard Littlejohn describes Ronaldo as his samba dancer boyfriend, for example. And this sort of coverage continued well into the 2010s.
What the fuck?
Yeah, I know. What does that mean? It's just pure nonsense. Right. This continued for at least another decade, this sort of coverage. When Mandelson was in Brussels as trade commissioner, Littlejohn described him as living at the, quote, Rue de Jeunes Garçons, the road of young men, or the road of young boys. The Daily Telegraph described him as having the, quote, reassuring daily company of his, quote, handsome Brazilian boyfriend, which is a very peculiar way of describing, you'd never see a heterosexual male politician described like that. You'd probably see something similar in terms of misogynistic innuendo referring to female politicians. But what does that mean, his handsome young boyfriend, in that way? And Simon Heffer, who is now a Conservative peer, described him as Lord Rumba of Rio. According to Lance Price, one of Blair's spin doctors, Mandelson resisted any attempt to push back on this homophobia or even to come out officially. He said at the time, quote, my private life is not secret, but it is private. In some ways, I think that's fair. I think we can discuss the implications of that when it comes to other people in his private life later on, and the fact that his private life and his political life blur extensively. But in their second term in office, Labour had begun to implement some major reforms on LGBTQ rights off their own back, rather than as a result of being forced to by European Court of Human Rights rulings. Between 2003 and 2005, there was a slew of groundbreaking legislation. In 2003, Section 28 was finally repealed after 15 years on the books. And in the same year, they also introduced the Employment Equality Sexual Orientation Regulations, which made it illegal to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation in the workplace. The following year, in 2004, they introduced the Civil Partnerships Act, which produced a new legal status for gay and lesbian couples. That law was, I think, in many ways, a fudged gay marriage bill, and it extended to same-sex couples pretty much all of the rights that different-sex married couples received in issues like, property rights, visitation rights to hospitals, pension, social security rights, inheritance, etc., etc. But it was a fudge, in my opinion, by a government that was not really willing to expend political capital on a sort of hot-button culture war issue like gay marriage. But it shouldn't be sniffed at. It was significant, and it made a lot of queer people's lives a lot easier. Gay marriage would actually have to wait until a Conservative government. It became law in England, Scotland and Wales in 2014, and in Northern Ireland in 2020. And in 2004, they passed the Gender Recognition Act, which allowed some trans people to be legally recognised in the gender they live in. This was a groundbreaking piece of legislation at the time, which again shouldn't be sniffed at, but it only allowed that change through a process of medical gatekeeping. It was a very flawed act as well in its way, and attempts to update that legislation have been dragged into this anti-trans moral panic around trans people in the past decade.
What's behind this sudden increase in ambition for New Labour as it comes to gay rights at this time? Is it that they've gotten a second term, like now they're able to move on some social stuff or spend some political capital on some stuff that's further down their list? Is it a shift in public conversations? Because even in the last episode, we were talking about a prevailing culture that was still deeply homophobic and a New Labour government that wasn't particularly interested in challenging that prevailing culture.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both those things. They were returned with a second landslide election result, which again gave them a huge amount of political capital and a mandate to change things. I think there was also a sort of wider social change that was happening across British culture. I think they felt they owed it to a lot of their gay, lesbian, bi, trans supporters. And I think they thought it was the right thing to do. I think they weren't necessarily prepared to risk it in the first term, but by the second term, it became much more politically feasible to pass it and also to get support from other parties.
And how controversial were these measures when they were brought in? Was there a real attempt by kind of the mainstream opposition to scandalize this, or is this opposition to this limited to the kind of fever swamps of right-wing opinion pages?
There was a major sort of debate around a lot of it, especially civil partnerships. Section 28 at this point, I think, had kind of run its course and was seen to have been a real stumbling block in tackling stuff like school bullying. There was a sort of quite heated debate around things like civil partnerships, which is why they went for civil partnerships rather than gay marriage. And that would be repeated 10 years later when Cameron did bring in gay marriage, and he did it on the back of Labour votes, not Tory votes. There was significant resistance within his own party to it, as we discussed, the sort of Baroness Youngs of the world. But again, it was one of those things, it was quite a difficult time because there were lots of these conversations happening in public around sexuality. It was in the news a lot. But despite this raft of measures that was definitely key in both reflecting this change in social attitudes and also helping to protect our rights, Mandelson was far from the face of these changes. People like Chris Smith, who'd come out in the 1980s, were significant cheerleaders for this. Mandelson wasn't. And again, he's got no obligation to be. Even if he benefits from them, he's not obliged to make himself the face of it. But his decision to leave the UK, spurred, I think, in part by this homophobic press coverage he received in the UK, is a sign that being gay in public life was still far from a walk in the park. But things would change, it wasn't always to be this way. And in 2023, Peter and Reynaldo took advantage of the change in social attitudes and in the law and made each other, let's say, honest men. Maybe he made Reynaldo an honest man. I don't know if Reynaldo made Peter an honest man. And he married at Old Marylebone Town Hall. The following day, Peter published an account of their relationship, I think for the first time in public, in The Times, in which he wrote, quote, "I'm of the generation of gay men who lived their early adult lives between the legalization of homosexuality in 1967 and the introduction of gay marriage in 2014. It was a period when we did not legally have to hide, but public attitudes and especially the tabloid media climate about gay people was totally different from today's. My choice as someone who was gay and with a high profile was not to make my personal life and sexuality a secret, but to try to keep it private rather than in the public eye. It was a path that felt necessary at the time, but it caused endless problems and real distress," end quote. But plenty of other changes had happened to Mandelson over that period, including perhaps one of the most unlikely political marriages in British history. In May 2007, while Mandelson was still in Brussels, a decade after the landslide victory in his first general election as Labour leader, Tony Blair announced he would stand down as Prime Minister. It was clearly the end of the line for Tony Blair, who had become increasingly unpopular over his tenure as PM, from a 65% approval rating in 1997 to minus 40% a decade later.
Oh, God.
Yeah. The reforming zeal that was associated with his first term, his first election, had totally gone by this point. Now his public profile focused instead on his disastrous cheerleading of the war in Iraq, the death of the weapons inspector, David Kelly, a destabilizing fuel crisis that happened at the start of the decade, his Middle East policy, of course, a cash for honours scandal, and an increasing sense that he was far more comfortable in the world of the rich and the famous than in conversation with the ordinary voter. This is not an exhaustive list of things people hate about Tony Blair, of course, but we've already gone for 4.5 hours. We don't have another 4.5 hours to finish it.
I would add his messianic devotion to the concept of national ID cards as...
His sort of authoritarian crackdown on civil liberties. Leave your favourite Tony Blair crime in the comments below. But he had, of course, promised Gordon Brown that he'd only serve for 2 terms, but it wasn't until halfway through his third term that he was announcing that he was going to leave. And Brown won a leadership contest after his only other challenger, the left-wing MP John McDonnell, failed to get enough nominations to run. And we'll hear a lot more from John McDonnell later. But it was truly a poison chalice that he was given by Blair, or maybe less a poison chalice, more like a teacup full of shit. Labour was polling below the Conservatives for the first time since the early 1990s. And of course, we all know what was just around the corner, the global financial crisis. And when the crisis hit its most acute stage in September of 2008, Brown reshuffled his cabinet again in order to better address it. And to almost everyone's surprise, he brought back his old frenemy, Peter Mandelson, as Secretary of State for Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform. So I know what you're thinking, Ben. Well, Peter Mandelson is European Commissioner. He's not an MP, so how can he get a place in the cabinet? Is that what you're thinking?
It is what I was thinking, but because it's England, I presume that they just made him the Baron of something or other.
Exactly. We encounter here Britain's charming unwritten constitution once again. There's actually no legal obligation at all for a Prime Minister to choose MPs to sit in their cabinet. What usually happens if you want to have an unelected Secretary of State is you make them a member of the House of Lords. Although even that isn't strictly speaking a legal necessity. In fact, for 20 days in 1963, the actual Prime Minister himself was neither an MP nor a member of the House of Lords. It's a very weird system. But Brown had Mandelson ennobled as Baron Mandelson of Foy and Hartlepool. And he was put into this very important cabinet role to help him tackle the global financial crisis.
The Baron of Hartlepool sounds like a kind of charming BBC series about like a slightly drunk northern guy who solves crimes.
Yeah, either that or it's got a little bit of sort of wind in the willows, Mr. Toad, like pop, pop, Baron of Hartlepool coming through. Political commentators at the time were stunned by this seeming sort of entente between these two men who for 15 years had worked relentlessly to undermine each other's positions. And Gordon defended his appointment as one of pragmatism. He said, quote, "He's built up a reputation over the last few years as someone who can get things done. It's incredible how big decisions about the economy are reduced to a question about 1 or 2 personalities. Whatever the ups and downs have been in the past, everybody has got to come together and make sure that as a nation, we come through this successfully," end quote. And indeed, the New Labour faithful lined up behind him to support him. David Blunkett, the Labour hardcore authoritarian who actually introduced indefinite detention into British prisons, he said that the appointment was, quote, "a masterstroke." John McDonnell, the veteran left-winger, disagreed. He called it, quote, "an extraordinary step backwards into the worst elements of the Blair era to reinstate possibly the most divisive figure in Labour's recent history," end quote. The Guardian, meanwhile, reported that Mandelson had, quote, "sashayed back into the cabinet," end quote.
Sashayed? Oh, fuck off. I mean, stop making me root for this man, homophobic British media.
Right.
The other thing is it really does say something that only a few years after the Iraq War, right, it's Mandelson who's being cited as, you know, one of the most sort of divisive and disruptive forces in that kind of New Labour project.
Right, and not Blair or Brown themselves. But obviously his appointment wasn't without controversy at the time. His time in EU Commission was marked by suspicions and scandals surrounding his very close relationships with the wealthiest people in the world. Even when he was settling into his new role in the cabinet, a new scandal was emerging, with the Sunday Times reporting how that summer Mandelson had attended a party on the Queen K, a 238-foot super yacht moored just off the coast of an enormous villa near Cassiope in Corfu, an area that's sometimes referred to as Kensington-on-Sea because it's referring to this sort of upmarket area of West London because of its high density of oligarchs and politicians who have places there. The villa itself belonged to Mandelson's friend Nat Rothschild, now Baron Rothschild. The yacht belonged to a friend of Rothschild's, Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch who had made his $4 billion fortune, like most Russian oligarchs, through this sort of shock doctrine moment at the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he went on to found Rusal, the world's second largest aluminium corporation. So as EU Trade Commissioner, Mandelson had helped end anti-dumping measures in aluminium, as well as halve the aluminium trade tariff, both of which massively helped Rusal's business interests. So here's a fantastic example of Mandelson in action. This cut in the trade tariffs happened in 2006. So when in 2008 the story hit the newspapers, Mandelson's spokesman released to the Times a schedule of all the times that he'd met Deripaska, starting in 2006 and ending in 2008. With the implication being that there was no pre-existing friendship. This was their first meeting. And when it was later revealed that they'd actually known each other since 2004, Mandelson said, quote, "Some people form the reasonable view, therefore, that my first meeting with him was in 2006. This is not the case. To the best of my recollection, we first met in 2004, and I met him several times subsequently," end quote. How amazing that for some reason people reasonably formed that view. Like you were the one who said, here are all the times I met him since 2006. But at the time of the yacht party, the EU Trade Commission was in the middle of another investigation into aluminium foil tariffs. And this was not Mandelson's first scandal regarding a potential conflict of interest as EU Commissioner. Indeed, it wasn't even Mandelson's first scandal as EU Commissioner. It involved a yacht. In 2005, he spent his New Year's Eve on the Octopus, a 414-foot yacht belonging to Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, despite the fact that the EU Commission was involved in a protracted court dispute with Microsoft. In 2006, he was also photographed aboard the Marlin, which was a meagre 52-footer, although it does have the added bonus that it once belonged to JFK. So this boat was now owned by the Italian shoe magnate and owner of the luxury shoe brand Tod's, a guy called Diego Della Valle. And this just happened to be at the time when the EU Commission was imposing tariffs on imports of Chinese shoes. So this is all starting to sound a bit like an episode of Arrested Development. Mandelson justified his socializing on the Andrew Marr Show, a British TV show, saying, quote, "You cannot do business as a European Trade Commissioner in Russia, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, all the big emerging economies of the world, without having contact with the big business and economic figures in those countries, as well as the political figures," end quote, which I think is a very telling phrase, isn't it? You cannot do business as a European Trade Commissioner.
Right. He's definitely there to do business. I mean, there's also one big club and you're not in it. Our subscribers on Patreon and Apple Podcasts make it possible for us to do all of the work of creating this show and to give out all of the main feed episodes for the show for free. That means our main episodes, our special episodes, and also exciting special projects like this one. And we've got more in the works.
So to help support Bad Gays, head on over to patreon.com/badgayspod or look for us on Apple Podcasts. Subscribers also get access to Extra Bad Gays, a monthly podcast where me and Ben talk about everything queer-related in culture, media, politics, as well as answering questions about love, sex, and everything else from our listeners in our regular Gaggany Gunkles section.
And as we've stated, if you subscribe to Extra Bad Gays, you can always listen one episode ahead to the entire Mandelson A Homosexual History miniseries. So do head over and check it out. Thanks.
So how did this cozy little party on the yacht come to light? How did the media find out about it? Well, also in attendance at Nat Rothschild's villa was an old school friend of Nat's. They'd attended prep school together as children before becoming members of the infamous Bullingdon Club while studying together at Oxford. His name was George Osborne, who was at the time the Shadow Chancellor, so that's nice. And at this party, George and Peter had like a nice chinwag, And so when Peter returned to the cabinet that autumn, Naughty George told some of his friends at the Sunday Times about this conversation and about Deripaska, and also that Peter had been less than glowing about the Prime Minister Gordon Brown. The phrase that was used at the time was that Peter, quote, dripped pure poison about Gordon. When Gordon appointed Peter, George Osborne leaked the conversation, and so it was news again. So how do you prove corruption in a system of court politics like this, when everything's happening at these parties, everything's recorded, everything's these sort of tacit agreements?
Yes, it's all like way too cozy by half, and it's sort of, it feels like an insult to your intelligence to not see what's going on here. But at the same time, there's so many ways that it's all sort of carefully constructed so that you can never make a certain kind of definitive claim.
Right. And Mandelson often resorts to this sort of defense of naivety, that he hadn't really thought about the implications of how it might look, but he never did anything wrong. He's so innocent about it that he didn't even occur to it. But of course, this is why EU trade commissioners shouldn't be having parties. This is why it's a conflict of interest, whether or not corruption emerges or not. You need to be seen not to be doing these things. But Mandelson has, very keen political instincts, very sharp, and he weathered that storm unscathed because in an extraordinary turn of events, it was Nat the Rothschild himself who exercised what I think we can probably call like class discipline against George Osborne for breaking the sacred bond of silence of the super yacht. And he wrote an extraordinary letter to the Times, not only chastising Osborne, but making a very shocking counter-allegation. Here's his letter, quote, I'm surprised that you focus on the fact that one of my guests, Peter Mandelson, is a friend of another, Oleg Deripaska. Not once in the acres of coverage did you mention that George Osborne, who also accepted my hospitality, found the opportunity of meeting with Mr. Deripaska so good that he invited a Conservatives fundraiser, Andrew Feldman, who was staying nearby, to accompany him onto Mr. Deripaska's boat to solicit a donation. Since Mr. Deripaska is not a British citizen, it was suggested by Mr. Feldman, in a subsequent conversation at which Mr. Deripaska was not present, that the donation was channeled through one of Mr. Deripaska's British companies. Mr. Deripaska declined to make any donation. I mention this because it turns out that your obsession with Mr. Mandelson is trivial in light of Mr. Osborne's actions. I also think it ill behooves all political parties to try and make capital at the expense of another in such circumstances. Perhaps in future it would be better if all involved accept the age-old adage that private parties are just that, end quote. So Rothschild is saying that Osborne himself tried to solicit what would be an illegal donation from this Russian oligarch on the yacht and funnel it through a semi-legal source, something, of course, that the Tory party then denied vigorously. So I think this incident, which is known in the British media as Yachtgate, is a perfect example of the main thesis throughout this whole mini-series. We should think of the transnational capitalist economic and political system not as a conspiracy, nor as a struggle between, say, conservative or liberal tendencies, but as a court politics that's aimed at managing the interface between the public and this political system in a way that's non-disruptive as possible to the beneficiaries of those economic forces. I'm specifically not alleging corruption because it's impossible to know because of the conflict of interest. Like they shouldn't be having these meetings on boats because there's no record, there's no minutes, there's no paper trail, and whether or not corruption did take place, and I'm not alleging it did take place, there is a conflict of interest by the fact that they're having these conversations there in the first place. Like the party on the boat isn't a conspiracy; it's how the system works. And that's why, despite this scandal that reveals this level of privilege that would, make the sans-culottes gasp, Peter Mandelson still became the business secretary. George Osborne still became Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Deripaska still had $10 million with which to pay Paul Manafort, who was later Trump's campaign chairman, allegedly to further Russian interests. This is just how it works. So despite this little indiscretion about Gordon Brown, he was welcomed back into the cabinet, if not with open arms, then at least in the spirit of forgiveness. In 2010, a close friend of his described it thus, quote, he was removed twice from the government in disgrace. When they offered him redemption, he grabbed it, end quote. That friend was the financier Jeffrey Epstein, emailing a friend shortly after his release from house arrest for sexual offences against minors, and more of him later. So as Secretary of State, Mandelson was an integral part of Brown's team when it came to handling this global financial crisis. And indeed, it was almost certainly his links, his close personal and working relationships with those in the banking sector, that Brown saw as being such an asset. But for Brown himself, his once formidable reputation as this big hitter, as this titan, was sort of crumbling around him like a Greek tragedy. He'd lost his touch. Early in the financial crisis, the leader of the Lib Dems, Vince Cable, had delivered a withering blow on the floor of the House of Commons, saying, quote, "The House has noticed the Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the past few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean," end quote.
That is a good line, I have to say.
And accurate. That was what it seemed like in terms of his public presentation in the media. And by 2010, Labour hadn't led in the opinion polls for over 2 years. And so in the election of May 2010, Labour lost to the Tories, although they were unable to win a majority, so they had to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats. With this new Chancellor, George Osborne of the Yacht, launching an austerity programme that eviscerated public services and welfare in the UK, and which, according to a study from the University of Glasgow, led to 250,000 excess deaths in the UK over the period. According to the University of Oxford, nearly a quarter of children born in the UK since that election have lived in poverty for more than half of their life. Among all our conversations about yachts and oligarchs and headlines and gay bars in Rio, I think it's really important not to lose sight of what politics does and can do and what its consequences can be. And in this case, we're talking about millions of ordinary people having their lives destroyed, their communities destroyed, their sense of hope destroyed by this process of austerity designed by these men who are, swanning about on 400-foot yachts in Corfu.
Well, what do you think pays for the 400-foot yachts in Corfu?
Yes, exactly, yeah. But in 2010, Mandelson didn't have his life destroyed. He started a lobbying company called Global Counsel. Get ready for a list of truly the most evil corporations, a sort of Paul Verhoeven level of 1980s capitalist mega villain.
All right, hit
His
me.
clients included Palantir, who later signed a £330 million contract with NHS England, OpenAI, Nestle, JP Morgan, Shell, and even Water UK, which is the trade association for the water companies that have been pumping their executives full of bonuses while pumping Britain's lakes and rivers full of human shit. Those are privatized water companies that used to be held by the public and now reap massive profits for their shareholders and bonuses for their executives, while the Lake Windermere is now almost ecologically dead because of the amount of sewage that's been pumped into it by these people who are taking home millions in bonuses. But he didn't retire from politics despite running this massive lobbying company. He was still a member of the unelected Second Chamber, the House of Lords. And what's more, he was reinvesting his time and energy back into his favourite youthful politics, which is Labour factionalism. And you'll see now, Ben, why I insisted on dedicating the whole of episode 1 to the criminology of Labour history in the 1970s and 80s, and especially the Labour Party civil war, because that's a battle that structured Mandelson's life and way of seeing the world even longer than his association with the wealthy and famous that he had started to cultivate in the early 90s. We talked a little bit about militant tendency in that episode, which was a Trotskyist pressure group within the Labour Party built around a newspaper, Militant. So the idea of these internal pressure groups, they're sometimes called ginger groups because they sort of ginger up the debate. That's not unusual within the Labour Party at all. Perhaps the most famous of these is Momentum, which is this group that was formed to support Jeremy Corbyn's leadership about a decade ago. But we also discussed Labour Solidarity Group, which was a Labour right organisation formed by Roy Hattersley and John Smith to oppose the Labour left, amongst others. And so here I want to talk quite quickly about 3 other very important organisations on the Labour right that are key to this period of Mandelson's career. The first of which is fittingly called Labour First, and it's a successor to the Labour Solidarity Group. It's the traditional old Labour right. The other is called Progress. That was formed in 1996 to support Blair. It's an explicitly new Labour organisation, which is different from the old Labour right. And then the third is called Labour Together, now referred to as Think Labour, and that was established in 2015 in order to bring down Corbyn as the Labour leader. And like many other groups, they operate as think tanks, they advocate for their own positions within the party, and they act as sort of informal caucuses, often battling with each other. And at one point, Progress were extremely influential within the Labour Party and extremely well funded. Writing in 2012, the former Labour MP Michael Meacher said that the group raised more money than the Green Party or Plaid Cymru. this group within the Labour Party is raising more money than other political parties as a whole. And according to Meacher, they actually raised 122 times more money than any other of those Labour internal groupings. We're talking about, almost £5 million in less than 20 years. It remains a influential hub for what's left of New Labour today. Up until recently, Mandelson sat on the strategy board of Progress. And when Wes Streeting announced that he was going to run in any future Labour leadership campaign to replace Keir Starmer, he said it at a Progress conference. That's the sort of world we're talking about. That's the vibe. In 2013, there was a Labour selection process to choose a new candidate for a seat in Falkirk after the sitting Labour MP, a man called Eric Joyce, resigned from the Labour Party after having got pissed in a House of Commons bar and headbutted a Tory MP. Falkirk was the home of the Grangemouth refinery, which was Scotland's only crude oil refinery. And members of Unite, which was a trade union which is affiliated with the Labour Party, began organising to recruit their local members to join the Labour Party in order to vote in the new candidate selection process. And crucially, their membership fees to the party were going to be paid by the union, Unite. This, of course, raised the hackles of the Labour right. They were already smarting from the victory of the soft left Ed Miliband, who'd beaten his Blairite brother, David Miliband, to the leadership of the party. Everyone expected David Miliband to take it. Ed Miliband got it. And they were increasingly worried about this resurgent trade union power within the Labour Party. Mandelson, writing for Progress after addressing their conference, lamented, quote, "the ability of a small cabal in London to dictate to party members who should be the Labour candidate in their seat," end quote. Because, of course, New Labour has always been against parachuting in candidates from London.
And of course, he became the MP for Hartlepool because he represented the collective political aspirations of the Labour movement there.
Right. I mean, he wasn't parachuted in, but he was a carpetbagger. But New Labour were notorious for parachuting unpopular candidates who were important for the New Labour government into safe seats. Sean Woodward springs to mind, a former Tory who was parachuted into a safe seat. Anyway, Unite reacted to these allegations of vote rigging, essentially, by saying, quote, "the intervention by party officials into this process has been driven by Blairite pressure to exclude trade unionists from any influence in the party, an ambition clearly spelt out by Peter Mandelson last month," end quote, referring to at the Progress conference. In Mandelson's Progress article, he wrote, quote, "New Labour should have done more, much more, to reform the party to make it more open and outward-looking. And we should have treated John Smith's achievement of one member, one vote in 1993 as the start of a process of democratisation, not as its completion," end quote. So as a consequence of this move by the Labour right to attempt to tackle trade union influence within the selection scandal, there was this review into Labour's internal democracy and the introduction of a true one-member, one-vote system. This is the last step of a move away from this sort of, first of all, the block vote system that was you had in the 1970s, then you had this electoral college system, and then as a result of Falkirk and an attempt to suppress the left, they introduced a true one-member, one-vote system. And the idea of this is to prevent the trade unions and the left from using trade union influence to influence the party. So let's cut to 2015 and the first Labour leadership election under those new rules, and camera zooms to a close-up of Progress as a sort of Goofy the dog. He's like pulling his collar and taking this massive gulp as their endorsed candidate, Liz Kendall, receives 18,000 votes, compared to the winning candidate under this new system, one member, one vote, Jeremy Corbyn, who polled over 250,000 votes. To quote Chris Morris again, as I did in an earlier episode, "This is the one thing we didn't want to happen."
Right, and Corbyn is even more objectionable to these people than, say, Ed Miliband, right?
Yeah, Ed Miliband is a soft left politician, very palatable in a lot of ways to a lot of people. Jeremy Corbyn is much further left, and he's a sort of inveterate rebel against his own party. He was always rebelling against the Labour Party. So suddenly, after having had control of the Labour Party for decades, the Labour right were now out in the cold, and their vision for Britain had been fundamentally rejected by the vast majority of its members and supporters. Peter responded by doubling down his efforts to crush the Labour left. Referring to Jeremy Corbyn, Mandelson said, quote, "I work every single day to bring forward the end of his tenure in office. Every day I try to do something to rescue the Labour Party from his leadership," end quote. It's quite an astonishing phrase. It's the sort of thing that would have sent him absolutely apoplectic with rage and reaching for expulsion if it had been uttered by anyone in the left under Kinnock or at any time since. Like for a member of the House of Lords, a member of the Labour Party, to say like every single day I tried to destroy the Labour leadership and to remain within the party, that really shows the lie that is the idea that Corbyn was purging the Labour Party of the right. That you could easily have kicked him out.
No, I mean, he should have done.
He should have
done. The worst thing Corbyn ever did was he had like popular power behind him. And at this moment when his popular power among Labour members was at its peak, instead of heightening the contradictions and just evicting all of these people to from whence they came, he tried to sort of keep it all together. And then it came time to move against him. They were all still there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Agitating from within.
But Mandelson's position is true. He, over the 5 years of Corbyn's leadership, Mandelson absolutely dedicated himself to his old battle against the Labour left. And in 2017, Mandelson was introduced to the founder of this new anti-Corbyn think tank that I'd mentioned, Labour Together, which was aimed at uniting opposition to Jeremy Corbyn. That founder was a young apparatchik called Morgan McSweeney. They were actually introduced by Roger Liddell. I don't know if you remember him. He was the Labour turned STB turned Labour political operative whom Mandelson had helped to defeat in the Fulham by-election. He never won a seat in Parliament under either Labour or SDP. He's now in the House of Lords. And he's also on the board of directors of Progress. So Roger Liddell would host these dinner parties at his house to discuss strategy, Labour strategy and anti-Corbyn strategy specifically. And Mandelson was obviously invited alongside Morgan McSweeney, as well as the Labour MP Wes Streeting, who attended with his fiancée, Jo Dancy, who had also been an advisor to, would you believe it, Peter Mandelson.
It's one big club and you're not in it.
So between the media, between this anti-Corbyn tendency, and between Corbyn's own ineptitude as a politician, as an actual politician, rather than as a sort of avatar of change that won a lot of support, the Corbyn project stumbled and eventually collapsed. And following the 2019 general election, in which Corbyn's Labour handed Boris Johnson's Conservative an 80-seat majority on the back of his Getting Brexit Done manifesto, Corbyn resigned and another leadership contest began. And it was won by Sir Keir Starmer, a former barrister and a director of public prosecutions. And he had stood, very interestingly, on a platform of being a unity candidate, much like Kinnock had in some ways. He was supposed to bring together the Labour soft left and the Labour right after this period of sort of unprecedented factional warfare between these groups. His platform was explicitly anti-austerity. He said he would, quote, unite Labour, defend its radical values and take on the Tories, end quote. He claimed he would reverse the cuts in corporation tax, he would abolish the devastating universal credit system, and he was pitched very much as a electable heir to Corbyn.
I mean, it was Corbynism without Corbyn, and it was pitched to members that way as basically an electable version of Corbynism, and you're not compromising on your values, and this is not the end of this project, and we are going to keep all of this going, but we're just going to do it in this sort of more electable and more acceptable way.
Right, and he was standing, his main opponent in that fight was Rebecca Long-Bailey, who was seen as the continuity Corbyn, and this idea that he could embrace a lot of those same values, but within a much more palatable political framework was what won him election. He said, quote, Labour must stand by its commitment to end the national scandal of spiralling student debt and abolish tuition fees. We lost the election, but we did not lose our values or determination to tackle the injustice facing young people going to university, end quote. And importantly, he seemed to be breaking with this Clause 4 shibboleth that New Labour had, saying, quote, public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders. Support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water. End outsourcing in our NHS, local government and justice system, end quote. And unsurprisingly, this soft left platform that acknowledged these changed priorities of the Labour movement, of Labour members and voters, it went down very, very well, and he won that leadership election.
You want some values? I got some values, and if you don't like, I got some other values.
Yet behind him were this team who had dedicated themselves to destroying Corbyn and they had absolutely no intention of implementing a soft Corbyn manifesto. Initially, Starmer appointed Morgan McSweeney as his chief of staff, or perhaps he had him appointed on his behalf. The degree of control which Starmer manages to command over his own operation, his own office, is let's say, a matter for public debate. But in 2021, Labour then had a series of devastating by-election results, including the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, where they received their worst ever election result with less than 700 votes, followed in short order by a by-election in Mandelson's old seat, Hartlepool, which they lost to the Tories. And Starmer was panicked at this inability to make ground, despite the unpopularity of the Tories at the time. At first, he thought about resigning, but then he decided to swing hard behind McSweeney. He sort of passed over control in a lot of ways to McSweeney and his campaign.
Do we have a sense of whether the promises that Keir Starmer made to Labour members to become leader of the Labour Party were ever sincerely meant?
Fascinating question. Starmer is not a political animal. The Labour Party is full of political animals. Burnham is, Streeting is, Angela Rayner is. I think he's out of his depth. It wouldn't surprise me if he felt that he could put together some sort of soft left coalition of supporters and voters afterwards, but he was just massively outplayed by his own team. I would maybe give him the benefit of the doubt, but he's also the beneficiary of an enormous amount of media goodwill to him. He was painted as this sort of figure. I think people say that he was the inspiration behind the character of Colin Firth in Bridget Jones' Diary. That he's often referred to as a human rights lawyer, but he was director of public prosecutions, for fuck's sake. So but I think one thing we can say about him is that whether or not he intended to, there was no chance of it happening because he doesn't have the political skill to take on his own team. If you've got Mandelson in the background, backseat driving, you have to be. You can't. You have to either kick Mandelson out of the car or let Mandelson drive.
It is. I mean, it is remarkable that someone with seemingly no particular qualities or no vision and no political skills like that, Keir Starmer just truly has. There's nothing going for him. I mean, except for the fact that he sort of vaguely looks the part.
Yeah.
Well, I think someone like Kinnock, all the Labour leaders got so far, right? Kinnock comes out of this kind of impeccable Labour tradition. Tony Blair has this sort of messianic fervor and this real sense of, and it's a sense I disagree with, but a real sense of how to turn this into this other thing, right? Gordon Brown has this sort of other approach to whatever. And then Keir Starmer is just talk about Mr. Bean.
Yeah, it's been quite interesting in recent months listening to podcasts, reading a lot of articles from, let's say, the media class, that the media class itself doesn't understand why he's so hated. They see him as fundamentally a nice guy. And you see it a lot in the resignation letters of people abandoning his cabinet like a sinking ship. They all say, I believe that you're a good person, motivated by, good values. And I think the media class do see that because he's one of them, and they find it very hard to see how other people might perceive him as someone who they feel lied to them. Like a lot of Labour voters voted for Keir Starmer because they wanted a soft left, Corbyn light political platform. He didn't give that. That's a deceit. And I think people are right to be angry about it. And I think it's a cultural issue, that people who are like Starmer, who work in the media, who come from that same background, Oxford educated professionals, they see him as, fundamentally a sound bloke. But to a lot of other people, he looks like just another suit. So yeah, Starmer had never really been this political animal in the same way, but now in making McSweeney the director of campaigns, he had ceded all direction for his party to McSweeney and his supporters. And any trace of his pledge to build a soft left unity coalition vanished. The purge of the Labour left continued apace, and he tightened his control over the selection processes. And this centralisation of decision-making and image management and image control echoed very closely that of Mandelson's in the 80s and 90s. The Sunday Times journalists Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, who described McSweeney both as, quote, the chief of staff who hoodwinked Labour membership into abandoning Corbynism with Starmer's soft left leadership campaign, end quote, and also, quote, the man who did run the Labour Party, end quote. They described this as, quote, the transaction that made him Prime Minister, end quote. One wonders really what the discussion was like at the next dinner party at Roger Little's house, if that happened. Incidentally, one of those Sunday Times journalists who wrote this expose on McSweeney and Starmer, Gabriel Pogrund, he was the subject of a report that was actually commissioned by Labour Together from a private investigator, because he had reported on the group's failure to register £700,000 worth of donations. These private investigators looked into the private lives of journalists who were critical of Starmer. That report was commissioned and then fed to GCHQ, the British Security Services, suggesting that the journalists were given these details from Russian intelligence assets, maybe even directly from the Kremlin. That is untrue. But the director of Labour Together, who commissioned that report, was someone called Josh Simons, who is now a Labour MP who has just stood down from Parliament in order to allow Andy Burnham to run in any potential leadership election.
Presuming, of course, that Andy Burnham can actually win that seat, which is not...
That's certainly not a given. And
certainly
also,
not a given.
Why did these two figures, who are so close to Mandelson, pave the way to allow Andy Burnham to stand when these two figures, Streeting and Simons, were both, supposedly backing Starmer? They've now sort of claimed to have lost confidence in him. But these two people were the ones who are Blairites, are the ones who have coordinated events to allow Burnham at least have a shot of running for leadership. Andy Burnham being the ostensibly soft left candidate. Maybe this is a good point to leave today's episode, I think. We've seen Mandelson weather both his controversies and scandals as a EU Trade Commissioner, being brought back into the cabinet, being made a member of the House of Lords, and then overseeing this campaign to destroy the Labour left and get into power his own figure, we'll say, his own man who is pliable and manipulable, perhaps nice, but not particularly effective, to where we are today, which is the crisis that's affecting Starmer's leadership. And I think in next week's episode, which will be the last one, we can discuss the final chapter of the saga, which is his appointment as ambassador to the United States and his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
And if you can't wait for the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, it's available right now to our Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers to Extra Bad Gaze. So click subscribe in Apple Podcasts or head to patreon.com/badgazepod and keep listening right now.
Bad gaze.